This recording was produced by Oregon Trail Baptist Church. If you'd like to get more recordings, or to leave your feedback, please visit us at www.otbchurch.com or write us at P.O. Box 298, Guernsey, Wyoming 82214. We look forward to hearing from you, and we hope that today's recording will not just challenge your thinking, but will transform your life.
Numbers chapter 34 in your Bibles. Numbers chapter 34. Numbers chapter 34. Elizabeth, you want to give me a hand real quick? If you want to hand those out. Numbers chapter 34. We are getting very close to the end of the book of Numbers. And by doing some big Bible summary, this has allowed me to let these lessons be a little shorter and not bog down in some of these chapters that are a bit difficult for us. Being at the end of the book of Numbers, or towards the end here, this last section, they have had the second census. They have, the daughters of Zelophehad had issues with land inheritance, and they through Moses, they asked God what should be done. Joshua has been appointed as the next leader. As Moses is fading off the scene, we have some instructions for their calendar and vows, and we see some victory over the Amalekites. We have Gad and Reuben and the half-tribe of Manasseh choosing to accept inheritance outside the Promised Land. And last week we covered Numbers 33, which was a review or scrapbook shot of their journey, of remembering where they've been and what God had done, and what was the purpose I emphasized. Why was this review of their journey there? What emotion or what response was it supposed to bring the people toward? I'm sorry, to see what God had done. Say it again. Okay, remind him what he got. So what? Yeah. Okay. Remember how good God had been to them, even when they had been not good, and how God would be faithful and provide in the next stage of conquering the land. Numbers 34 gives us the division of the land. All right. So this is the huge portion of land that God is giving to his people. It is noted this was a gift from who? God. God is giving this land to his people. And it wasn't haphazard. It wasn't just, okay, here's the land, you guys figure it out. It was purposed, it was planned, it was deliberate. So there's going to be a division of the land by what? How are they going to divide the land? By tribes. Okay? And so in verses 1 to 15, we have this division beginning to take place. Israel, their response to God giving them the land is they're supposed to accept the truth of what God says, and they are to obey. One of the interesting questions is, didn't they already divide the land up in Numbers chapter 26? In Numbers 26, verses 52 to 56, they already mentioned divided the land by lots. So why would they do it twice? Possible. I'm not sure that's... Something has changed, though. Something that has changed that will change how the land gets divided. 2.5 tribes are not there. So, not that they're gone, that's not what I'm saying, but 2.5 tribes have have chosen what's called the Transjordan on the other side of the Jordan River. They've chosen to stay and settle there. They're going to help fight and conquer the land, but they're going to stay on the other side of Jordan. So now instead of the land being divided amongst 12 tribes, it's going to be divided amongst 9.5 tribes. And so it works out a little differently. So that's probably part of why they're doing this again. They're dividing it up by how much is in each tribe. What's interesting here is if you compare Numbers 34 with Joshua 14 and Ezekiel 47, there's a few things that happen. One, some of these locations, we have no idea where they are. Okay, they'll mention a place and we've got some educated guesses or some ideas, but time has erased some of these places. Maybe not totally erased, but anyway. You haven't found them yet, or been able to prove that's the right site. It is interesting. So I saw an article either yesterday or this morning. Some satellite footage taken during the Cold War by the Russians has been released, and archaeologists have found some of that footage and used it, and they've been able to identify Roman encampments of troops from back in the 1st century from satellite footage for the Russians released during the Cold War. And there's some really new technology taking place too, where they can take like satellite images and they can look with like sonar into the ground. So without even digging, they can see where structures and things are and placements and camps. So because of technology, archaeology is changing and they're still finding new things. Okay. All that to say, we still don't know where some of these places are for sure. But it does seem like what's happening in Numbers 24 is a bit of the ideal, or if you fully take the land the way God intends, this is what you'll have. Did they completely obey God? No. And even under Solomon and David, when the kingdom was at its highest, there were still portions of the land that should have been theirs that they didn't yet occupy. Okay, so that might be pointing to a future when it will be occupied, but anyway. Thoughts, questions there? This gets into a nitty-gritty discussion of like every little spot you isolate and you look at and you figure out, and I don't want to do that with Sunday school, nor do I have the interest to do that in general. So I'm sorry. A couple of helpful maps, page 5 here. I want to mention a quote from Dennis Cole. Although God had promised victory to his people, if they continued to obey his commands, nothing was left to chance in the organization of their new life in their own land. It wasn't just willy-nilly up to chance. There was purpose, there was plan, there was intention. There's a map there on page 5 that kind of gives a concept of where they would be taking and dwelling in the land, the section that would be divided up amongst all the tribes. I skipped a spot. Bottom of page 4. This is kind of interesting. In the bottom of page 4, in Genesis 15, we read of a division of the land that's a little different yet. It says, from the river of Egypt to the great river Euphrates. Wouldn't that include part of the Sinai Peninsula? That Israel would control part of the Sinai Peninsula. So again, that's kind of a big picture swath of the land of Canaan. Now, this brings up a little bit of a moral or ethical issue. How is it right for Israel to take the land away from the Canaanites? Okay. So the land belongs really to who? It belongs to God. In a sense, God did, yes. That's last week's. Well, that part there is because we're still working through that section to get to chapter 36. Here, Glenn, why don't you have one too? Sorry about that. That would be why your page 5 looks very different from my page 5. So there's the element here where God owns the land, and it's his land. There's a kids video for my children that explain it this way. If you own a toy and your friend A comes and asks to play with your toy, and you let friend A play with your toy, but friend B comes and wants to play with your toy, and you as the owner say, yes, friend B, you can play with it, but friend A will not give the toy up. Does friend A own the toy? No. Right. Yeah. Even though possession's 9/10 of the law. Right. That will not do so well in life. Good. Okay, and there's still a lot, like you say, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. There's part of that in that there, where Israel was specifically commissioned to commit genocide, was not widespread amongst all Canaanites. There's some ties to one groups that had been incredibly wicked. There's also some ties to groups. Those groups that were tied to giant clans were the groups where the harem, or the total destruction, the ban as it sometimes is referred, where everything was destroyed, was specifically the groups tied in with the giant clans. And that's kind of a long, complicated discussion, but there's something to that, because were all the Canaanites wiped out, right? And even in places where Israel had the victory, what about people like Rahab? They didn't wipe Rahab out. Yeah, so she ends up marrying a Jewish individual, and she ends up in the line of Messiah, which kind of gets us to this tension of, does God only want to save Israel, or does God want to save all people from all nations? He wants to save all people from all nations, which would include Israel, right? They are that light to the Gentiles, okay? Or should be. Just like we're to be light and salt in the world, and we're not always perfect at that, okay? So, part of that's what's taking place here. Comments, questions? Okay, I do want to note on the geography. In the ancient Near East, this is part of what's called the Fertile Crescent. I really should have put a map here for that. But where God chooses to place his people was not an accident. This was the major trade routes of the ancient world. If you were to go between Egypt and Babylon, or Egypt and Assyria, or Egypt and like the Hittite Empire that was up north, and some of these other groups, you went through the land of Israel. Which is interesting, because God put his people deliberately in a place where they're in the crossroads of the major empires of the world. And they're called to be a kingdom of priests. Talk about a perfect spot for an idea to be spread, for an understanding of who the Lord is. And also talk about a spot, a land that will be, how to say this, constantly fought over. And it has been, and it will be, in fact, before this, before the Israelites get there, Egypt had a massive control of Canaan. And they had control up into this area. It's not that Egypt's empire was completely up here, but they were, it was like a vassal state, as it were. Egypt did a lot to control the region of Canaan. Now, what happened to Egypt before Israel left? Yeah, everything's tanked. So it's a perfect it's a perfect storm, as it were, and we know it's not just a storm, but we know it's God's design. Egypt has lost their control over Canaan. Now you have these individual city-states, and God's people are prepared to come in and take the land that God's giving them. So God works, and he has purpose and plan, and he knows what he's doing. In the second section of Numbers 34, verses 16, really through the end, or almost the end, we have a list of tribal leaders. All these are completely new names, except you have Caleb and Joshua. These are the guys who survived from the previous generation. They were the 2 out of the 12 spies who came back in a report of faith. And so these are the new leaders. So it seems like what's happening is, yes, the land, so this portion of land is going to this tribe, but then this leader is dividing it up within that about what family gets this area and who gets this, and then they're dividing it up there. And then in Joshua chapters 13 and 19, we read of the actual dividing up of the land. Right now they're dividing it up on a piece of paper. Okay? Then they're going to go in and fight, and then the actual division and beginning to settle takes place. A couple things I just want to emphasize. God works. His way is perfect, and he knows what he's doing. He's giving Israel a specific piece of land. He's giving them specific allotments for specific tribes. He knows what he's doing. And although for us it may be a little disconnected, you know where the boundary markers are for most part on your property. And the ancient Israelites were reading this map going, okay, these are the boundary markers for our property and where we live and where our clan or our tribe is. And this was very important to them. Next week we'll get into the one exception, as it were, groups who don't get land as much as they get cities. But comments or questions as we close out? Yeah. Israel has, today's population of Israel makes the population back then look insignificant. Like, there's way more people in Israel today than there was back then. Well, there's a lot more people there, but also you didn't have high-rise apartments back then. Yeah. Sure. Yes. There. Yeah. To Israel. Which is interesting. We had some Jewish individuals at our house, I think it was last year, and they were talking about how if you're Jewish and you want to marry a non-Jew, the only way to do it in Israel is you have to go out of the country to get married, and then you come back to the country with your wife. They won't allow a Jew in Israel to marry a non-Jew. So most of them will go to a place like Greece, and apparently there's an entire industry built around nations around Israel who will let Jews marry other people, and they, like wedding planning groups. But yes, there's a lot of Jews in Israel today. You also have other groups there, and there's way more Jews because a lot of time has passed, and a lot of Jews have had children, and families have grown. But you have, all throughout the world and world history, different groups have tried to annihilate or get rid of the Jews, and that is forced persecution. Yeah. Oh, you're fine. Yeah. Yeah. Right. Reading? Yes. Yeah. To highlight there. This is an interesting part of history I did not read in any sort of biblical book, but as actually a secular historian who noted this, and then I'm going to add the biblical perspective. There was a Jew towards the end of World War II making proposals to like the United Nations and the Allied forces of what should we do with this group of people called Jews? Where should we put them? And on the table were places like Brazil, Argentina, Uganda. Like literally, we're going to carve out a spot in Uganda, and this is going to be a Jewish state. One of the lower options on the table was what today we call Palestine or Israel. And through a course of events and different things that happened and discussions and debates between the Allied forces, where do you think, and I'm going to put, the secular guy didn't say this, but I'm looking at this through biblical lens, where do you think God's finger led for these secular people, even though this man was Jewish, he was a secular Jew, he was an atheist or an agnostic, he didn't necessarily believe in God. Where did God move these men to create a state for Israel? Where they belong. Do you think that's an accident? Read history with the lens or eye of going, he's still on the throne. And it doesn't matter what forces are at work, he's still in control and still has a plan and purpose for his people. Yeah, a lot of the Middle East for sure. Yeah. Yeah. Check the door. Yeah. To do that. Yeah. A Jew. Yeah. There's been one of the reasons Germans hated Jews was Jews were in control or Jews ran much of the banking industry in Germany. A lot of your major scientists have been Jewish. Einstein, this is an interesting note in today's political climate where back in the 60s and 70s, this thing happened with orchestras where they began what they called blind auditions. Now they're calling for no more blind auditions. How blind auditions worked is you would go into a room, your name would be scrubbed. Whoever's listening would not know your name. They wouldn't know your gender. They wouldn't know anything about you. They would just be able to hear the music you produced with the instrument. It's called a blind audition. That way, racial prejudice were not in any way. That produced in orchestras that are like high and renowned and across the board in America, that produced more Jews and Asians being in orchestras than any other ethnic groups, which is kind of interesting. They're calling for today now, they need to racially diverse the orchestras and choose more off of ethnicity. Which I'm like, seriously, a black room, that is totally non-racist. It's dark, nobody can see through the curtain as it were. You don't know anything about this person, you're just allowing them in or out based off of their performance and what they can do. So, God has a hand and a purpose and a plan, and it hasn't changed. And God has uniquely, back to what we talked about the scripture reading, God has blessed his people. God has blessed the Jews through history. Now that doesn't mean every Jew is a good person. That doesn't mean that every Jew is even right with God. That's not what we're saying. But as a whole, they have been a blessed people through history. So, and I'm going to have to cut it off there because we are running out of time. But had a lot of great discussion today. Well, yeah, we ran out of time. So, Lord, we thank you that you're not a God, like the agnostic says, who created the world and let it go and no longer gets involved. But we can see, as this morning we looked into the Abrahamic covenant and the promise you made to him. As we've looked into Numbers with the division of the land and how you had a purpose and a plan and a design for your people. And even as we've bantered and talked a bit about world history and how you have divinely orchestrated and put events to place for the modern state of Israel to even exist. And no other people could say that they have lasted through exile of their land and dispersion among the nations. All other countries and nations and people groups have assimilated, and the Jews were close to doing that. But your purpose and plan brought them back to the land that you had given to Abraham. And Lord, would it stir confidence and faith in us that you have a purpose and plan for our lives. You have a divine direction of where we should go and what we should say and how we should live. And even though times may look tough, and even though things may not be what we want or expect, we can rest assured you're the King who's still on the throne. And history is not merely a record of events, but it's his story. It's your story unfolding in our world. We ask this in your son's name.